I'll introduce the speaker. Welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. I'm Anil Kashyap, and I'm a member of the society, and I'm going to be moderating today's program. If you're new to us, here's a little bit about humanism that comes from the Humanist Manifesto 3. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. Our programs here address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, art, science, and ethics, just to name a few. And today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming that's related to economics. Our speaker today is Johannes Stroebel. He's the David Loeb Professor of Finance at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's actually on sabbatical now in Munich, and thanks to the miracle of technology, he's able to join us from Europe. Johannes is one of the leading lights of the economics profession. He works on a range of topics, including climate finance, household finance, social network analysis, macroeconomics, and real estate. He's won a bunch of awards. I'm not going to list them all here, but this includes a Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, an Alfred Sloan Foundation Fellowship. He's a member of the Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee of the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, and also a member of the Working Group on Extreme Weather and Financial Risks at the President's Council of Economic Advisors on Science and Technology. So he's active in many, many areas. He read philosophy, politics, and economics at Merton College, Oxford, and got his PhD at Stanford. And today he's going to talk to us about his work on what Facebook interactions tell us about economic mobility. So without further ado, Johannes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anil, and thanks everybody for coming and listening to this presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen, and if you don't see it, give me a shout. So this is part of a broader research project that I've been working on together with my colleague at NYU, Teresa Kuchler, as well as Raj Chetty and Matt Jackson, and pretty broad and deep research team. And the motivation for this research project was our desire to better understand the determinants of upward economic mobility. What I'm going to talk about today is a summary of the findings from two recent research papers that we've published in the journal Nature early August. And in this specific research project, we study the role that social capital has in terms of determining upward economic mobility. But let me just take a step back from this specific project and motivate what we're after in this specific paper. So in many ways, upward economic mobility, the idea that individuals from relatively poorer backgrounds can rise up in the income distribution, is at the essence of the American dream. But prior research has shown that the degree to which there is upward economic mobility varies dramatically across the US. For this project, we're going to take a very specific definition of upward economic mobility. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at children whose parents were at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. And we're going to look at what their adult incomes at 35 are. And then we're going to look in the specific map here about how those adult incomes differ across the US. And one of the things you can see here is that there's some parts of the US, in particular the South, but also New Mexico, Arizona, etc., where individuals who grow up relatively poor stay relatively poor in adulthood. They barely move on average beyond their parents in the national income distribution. On the other hand, parts of the upper Midwest, parts that are blue on this map that you're seeing here, have much more upward income mobility. Individuals in those parts of the country with parents at the same level of the national income distribution, so same parental resources, grow up to earn much, much more in adulthood. And so this map here sort of shows these staggering differences across the US in upward economic mobility. And there's been a tremendous research effort over the last decade or so since we've seen these numbers, and I've been able to measure these numbers well, in terms of explaining what could be going on here. Oftentimes with a focus to try and figure out what can be done in those parts that are particularly red on this map, to get upward income mobility to the similar levels as those that are relatively blue on this map here. And the literature has provided a whole range of possible explanation, anything from sort of average income levels, school quality, racial segregation, historical redlining, family structure, etc. But overall, my read on this literature is that much of what we've seen on the prior map actually remains unexplained, that we haven't really had substantial success in terms of explaining why some parts of the US provide much more upward income mobility to children than others. One of the things that keeps coming up in debates in this field is that maybe one of the key things that could be going on here is the importance of what sociologists in particular call social capital, the structure of the communities, the structure of the social networks in these communities might be one of the possible determinants of differences in upward income mobility. And part of the motivation of our project was to try and test whether or not social capital can in fact explain why some parts have much more upward income mobility than others. As we started to think about this project, we started to realize that we had to take a much more serious step in terms of measuring social capital. And when we started to look into the literature, we realized that sociologists were using the same term, social capital, for a whole range of different concepts. And so the first part of our project was to really try and figure out, okay, so what do people actually mean when they use the term social capital, in order to help us, in a second step, to go out and more systematically measure social capital. And so the first type of concept that people have in mind when they talk about social capital is what we're going to call connectedness. This is also sometimes called bridging social capital in the literature. And the idea here is that a community's level of social capital could be captured by the degree to which individuals with different characteristics are connected to each other. So for example, a community's social capital could be measured by the extent to which rich and poor people in this community are connected with each other, or by the degree to which Democrats and Republicans are connected with each other, or the degree to which older and younger people are connected with each other. But really the core of this connectedness measure is that it's trying to capture the extent to which there are social links across individuals with different backgrounds. A second concept of social capital that shows up often in the literature, a concept we're going to call cohesiveness, or sometimes also called bonding social capital in the literature, is trying to measure the extent to which communities are tightly knit. So one example of this type of cohesiveness measure of social capital is the clustering of social networks within a community. Clustering, precisely defined, as the probability that two of my friends are also friends with each other. Right? And so more clustered, more tightly knit communities would be described as having higher extent of cohesiveness or higher degree of bonding social capital. And then there's a third notion of social capital that people have in mind. This is the notion that Robert Putnam exposed in his original book, Bowling Alone, and others have proposed similar notions of social capital, which is the extent of civic engagement. This measure of social capital doesn't really rely or capture necessarily a specific feature of networks, but it is trying to capture the extent to which there's volunteering or political engagement or things like that within a community. Right? So with these three broad definitions of social capital in mind, what are we going to try and do in this paper? The first thing that we're going to try and do is we're going to try to provide the first systematic measure of all of these different types of social capital at a very granular level, using anonymized microdata from Facebook. In a second step, we're going to try and analyze associations at the geographic level between these different measures of social capital and upward income mobility, trying to really understand, at least in a correlational sense, and we'll make some steps towards causal claims, is it the case that social capital is a driver of upward income mobility? And to the extent that it is, and we're going to find that some of these social capital measures are much better predictors of upward income mobility than others. We want to try and understand the determinants of social capital. What makes some communities have more social capital versus others? And using that in a last step to really try and understand possibilities of possible interventions that policymakers might make in terms of increasing the extent of social capital across different communities. So let's start out with what do we do to measure social capital. So we're going to start out, our baseline analysis sample is going to be a sample of US Facebook users between the ages of 25 and 44 as of May of this year. Overall, the sample is pretty big. It covers 72.2 million individuals who between them have more than 21 billion friendship links. The reason we focus on this millennial generation here is because this is the generation where within the US, Facebook usage coverage rates is way above 80%. So we really are doing a very good job in this data to capture population scale social networks. I'm going to first start talking about how we're going to measure the first concept of social capital, which is economic connectedness. The extent to which individuals from low and high SES backgrounds are friends with each other within a given community. Why do we think that economic connectedness might be related to upward income mobility? The literature has actually proposed a whole range of different reasons for such relationships. This could be anything from the amount of information given. So you might, for example, think that if a relatively lower SES kid becomes friends with more high SES kids, they learn about things like how do you apply to go to college, etc. It could be about direct resources that get passed through these networks, things like job referrals, internships, etc. But it could also be more diffuse things like the extent of aspirations and preferences that could be passed through these social networks. So there's a whole range of reasons to think why economic connectedness might be related to upward income mobility. Now, in order to measure economic connectedness in a community, the extent to which low and high socioeconomic status individuals are connected with each other, we first need to come up with some proxy or measure of socioeconomic status within the Facebook data. What we're going to do to create such an index of socioeconomic status is we're going to be combining several proxies that we observe in the Facebook data into sort of one unidimensional measure of socioeconomic status. Things like the zip code in which an individual lives, whether or not that individual went to college, the type of phone that individual uses, etc. Now, in our baseline measure of socioeconomic status, the one that's going to underlie the results I'll show you in this paper, what we're going to do is we're going to combine these measures in a way that best predicts median household income at the census block group, so a very narrow geographic unit, which is available for a subset of users, and we're going to create that best predictor using a simple machine learning model. And what we're then going to do is we're going to rank users in the national SES distribution. So everything when I'm going to talk about high versus low SES, this is not within a location, but this is individuals' position in the national SES distribution relative to others in their cohort. I want to say one thing, which is that the exact way in which we combine these different proxies doesn't turn out to be all that important. So in the paper we show, for example, that you get very, very similar results if instead of using this machine learning method to combine them, you just create a simple z-score, or maybe you just use one of the index components as your measure of socioeconomic status, right? So we use a sophisticated measure as our baseline in the paper, but actually that's not going to be at the heart of the results that we're producing. One of the things you would want to know is, well, are we doing any good in terms of capturing, true socioeconomic status or true income? And in order to reassure us that our proxies for socioeconomic status in the Facebook data are of high quality, what we do is we try and benchmark our SES predictions, at various levels of aggregation with publicly available data at those levels of aggregation. So, for example, we measure the extent of high SES individuals in a zip code, and we correlate that with the number of rich individuals from the census who live in that zip code, and we find a very high correlation. Similarly, we look, for example, within high schools, and we would compare the number of students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch, which is available in public statistics, against the number of students who say they go to that high school who have high SES parents in our data. And again, you get very high correlations. So we feel pretty comfortable that our measures of SES are capturing something meaningful and useful that would allow us to proceed with our research project. Okay, so let's look at some first findings here. So what we're going to try and do here is trying to understand the degree of what we're going to call homophily, or what the literature calls homophily, which is the extent to which individuals are friends with others that are similar to them. And what we're doing here is on the horizontal axis, we're plotting an individual's own SES percentile rank, And on the vertical axis, we're plotting the average SES rank of their friends. And what you can see here is that this is a strongly upward sloping relationship, which suggests that individuals who themselves are lower SES would also have friends who on average have lower SES. This is in many ways not surprising. We know that individuals are likely to be friends with others that are similar to them on a whole range of characteristics, and so income or socioeconomic status is another one where we would very much expect that. We're going to go way beyond this sort of simple national relationship and really trying to dig into geographic variation in the slope of this line, which really allows us to capture the extent to which different communities are segregated by socioeconomic status versus connected across socioeconomic status. Before I'm going to do that, though, I want to do one or two more quick checks to make sure that the data we're using is sensible. The first thing that we spend a lot of time thinking about is what it means to be Facebook friends with someone, right? Because many individuals, including people who'll be in the room, but also people in our data on average have hundreds of Facebook friends, and not all of them might be sort of actually very close friends. Some of them might just be relatively weak acquaintances. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. The economics literature actually spends, or the sociology literature also spends a lot of time talking why those types of weak ties might actually be very important for things like upward income mobility. But we wanted to make sure that our patterns weren't just driven by sort of the very close or the not very close friends at all. And so one of the things, for example, you can see in this graph here, is if I just focus on an individual's top 10 friends, rather than all of their hundreds of Facebook friends, we find very, very similar patterns in the degree of aggregate national homophily. The other thing that we can do is at the aggregate level, is we can try and benchmark our measures of homophily against those from publicly available surveys. And in particular, we can benchmark them against data from the @Health survey. So what I'm showing you here in green is a line very similar to what we had before from measured in the Facebook data, the extent to which, ranking people by their parents' SES on the horizontal axis and their friends' parents' SES on the vertical axis. And in purple, the purple squares are data from the @Health survey. So the @Health survey is it's a survey of US high school students that also asks them about their friendship networks. And one of the things you can see here is that while our data is much, much more precise than the @Health survey, I mean, we have thousands times more data points in our Facebook data than in the @Health survey data, the overall slope is very, very similar. So again, that makes us confident that the types of Facebook friendships we're picking up aren't sort of biased in a major way and correspond directionally to other external data sets that also trying to measure similar. So with that in mind, and because we have this dramatically expanded data set over and above the @Health survey, we can then go and start measuring the degree of economic connectedness, of cross-class connectedness, not just in the national distribution as I'm plotting you here, but also across subgroups and across areas. What we're going to do here is we're going to create a simple measure of economic connectedness. We can call it EC. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to basically look at the share of a low SES, below median SES person's friends that themselves are above median SES, and we're going to divide that by a half to get a number that scales nicely. So an EC of above 1 means more than half of your friends, or more than half of the friends of low-income individuals have high income, and an EC below 1 means that less than half of the friends of a low-income individuals are high income. In fact, nationally, we get economic connectedness to be about 0.78. So high SES friends are underrepresented by about 22% relative to a random friending benchmark where you're equally likely to become friends with every individual around you. Beyond this sort of aggregate measure, we're really interested in trying to understand the extent to which economic connectedness varies across the US. So this is again a map, but this time coloring different US counties by this measure of economic connectedness. Again, red are places where low-income people have very few high-income friends, and blue are areas where low-income people have a lot of high-income friends, right? And you can see again that our data allows us to measure this economic connectedness, in a very disaggregated way down to the county level. In fact, we can measure it down to the zip code level, and I'm going to show you some data on zip code, within metro area variation in economic connectedness in just a bit. Okay. Just one thing, I mean, in the interest of time, I won't be able to walk you through all of our social capital measures. We construct many of them, including other measures of connectedness by language and age. We also construct measures of the cohesiveness of networks. This again was sort of the density or of social networks, and we also construct measures of civic engagement, the extent to which individuals within a community volunteer, etc. Just one thing to point out from this correlation table is just the first column, which is the correlation of each of these measures with economic connectedness. And one thing you can see is that this correlation is relatively low. What does that mean? It means that these different concepts of social capital are actually meaningfully different. Areas can be rich in one type of social capital, but poor in other types of social capital. And so it's really important when you talk about social capital and its relationship with outcomes such as upward income mobility that you're precise about which of these measures do you mean, because again, some communities have a lot of one type of social capital, but not a lot of another. Okay. So with these measures then of economic connectedness in mind, what we can do in the next step is to study their association with upward income mobility, what I plotted on that very first map, the adult income rank of individuals growing up, relatively poor. And what I'm showing you on this slide here is just a simple across-county correlation between economic connectedness on the horizontal axis and upward income mobility on the vertical axis. And you can see that there's a very strong positive correlation here of about 0.65, which suggests that on average, those parts of the US where poor individuals have relatively more rich friends are also the exact same parts of the US where poor individuals have relatively higher chances of moving up the income distribution. So far, this is just a correlation. We're going to start digging into some possible causal mechanisms behind that correlation relationship. But for now, this is the correlation that we find. And I think what's really, really important, if you think back to the list of possible determinants, possible explanations for these differences in upward income mobility that I had on the second slide. Economic connectedness has a much higher correlation than any of these other predictors that we had on that second slide, right? So even just in terms of being able to explain that variation in a correlational sense, we're already doing much better than we've been able before, really hoping to add to our understanding of upward income mobility. What I'm showing you here is not just a correlation of upward income mobility with economic connectedness, which is what I'm showing you in the first row here, the 0.65 correlation, but I'm also going to show you the correlation in the other rows of upward income mobility with all of these other measures of social capital. And the really striking thing is that out of this whole range of things that the sociology literature has referred to as social capital, it really is only economic connectedness that's highly predictive of upward income mobility. All the other measures of social capital are not correlated with upward income mobility. Now, one important thing to mention here is that does not mean that those are wrong measures of social capital in some sense. In fact, it could well be, and we have some evidence that it is, that other outcomes, things like life expectancy, might be more correlated with things like network cohesiveness rather than economic connectedness. But again, what it means is that social capital isn't like a uniform, unidimensional concept. In fact, it has many, many components, and different components matter for different outcomes. For the outcome we care about in this project here, upward income mobility, it really only is economic connectedness that seems to be strongly correlated. And so in the rest of today's talk, I'm going to focus on better understanding that relationship, because that's really what jumps out at you when you look at these correlations. Now, I talked before that economic connectedness may have a causal effect on upward income mobility through a variety of mechanisms, right? We talked about aspirations, we talked about information, we talked about direct resource transfer through things like referrals. But for now, it could also be that economic connectedness could be correlated with mobility, even in the absence of a causal effect, for a variety of reasons. In the paper, we spend a huge amount of time trying to address each one of these reasons. Here today, I don't have a lot of time, but I just want to mention very briefly what it is that we do and then point you to the research papers in case you're interested to learn more about it, what could be going on. So the first one is reverse causality. right? It could be, in terms of the causal mechanism that we have in mind, that economic connectedness drives upward income mobility, but it could also be that upward income mobility might be driving economic connectedness to the extent that the upwardly mobile children, make many rich friends after they've become rich, but still retain friendship links to their formerly or their still poor friends. In order to address this, and again, I have to point you to the paper for the details, we're going to not just look at the overall friendship networks that people make, but also trying to really hone in on the friendships that they form during childhood, trying to look at, for example, friendships only with other individuals who are in the same high school. The second type of concern you would have that could also just explain the prior relationship is one of selection. Right? You could just imagine that the people who live in areas that have high economic connectedness, they differ on other dimensions, things like race, education, whatever it could be, that by themselves mean that they would have higher upward income mobility, even independent of the amount of economic connectedness. In order to show that this type of selection is not going on, we're going to use a measure of upward income mobility that has been produced in the literature that uses a mover's design to get at the causal effect of a given location on upward income mobility. Basically, the idea is to look at individuals moving across different counties at different ages to really figure out what the causal effect of living in a given county is on upward income mobility. And again, it doesn't seem to be that this type of selection is a key determinant. And then lastly, you might worry that there's what economists would call an omitted variable bias, that there's other characteristics of neighborhoods that have high economic connectedness that would themselves be driving upward income mobility even in the absence of economic connectedness. Things like areas with more economic connectedness, i.e. areas where poor people have more rich friends, might be areas where average incomes are higher, and maybe it is their average higher income leading to better schools, more resources, etc., that's driving upward income mobility, not economic connectedness. So in order to study this, what we're going to do is we're going to compare the explanatory power of the strongest predictors identified in prior work versus economic connectedness. And what I'm going to do just in today's talk, because again, we're short on time, is I'm going to start by examining the role of average neighborhood incomes, which, in many ways is the most, salient marker that is currently used by policymakers to identify high opportunity areas. So the way I'm going to do that, I think, is economists usually like to run regressions, and you could do the same analysis in a multivariate regression, but I actually find it pretty compelling to study this in a graph. So what I'm plotting here is each dot is a US zip code. On the horizontal axis, we're plotting the average household income in the zip code. This could be capturing the school quality or resources available in the neighborhood. And on the vertical axis, I'm plotting average economic connectedness, the extent to which poor people in that neighborhood are connected to rich people. The first thing you notice is, unsurprisingly, there's a positive correlation between the two. Right? In areas where there's more rich people around, poor people living in that area are more likely to have rich friends. That's in many ways not surprising. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to color these dots by the extent of upward income mobility in that area. Where red dots are zip codes with low upward income mobility, poor kids growing up in these zip codes stay relatively poor in adulthood, and blue dots are high upward income mobility zip codes. Poor kids growing up in those zip codes become relatively richer in adulthood. And what we can now do is we can look at both vertical and horizontal slices of this graph to help us understand whether or not income mobility is driven by median incomes, the amount of resources in the neighborhood, or whether it's driven by economic connectedness. So the first thing to do is to focus on a vertical slice of the graph, as you can see here. So this is all zip codes with relatively similar median incomes, but very different amounts of economic connectedness. So the average person in these zip codes is equally rich, but at the top, the poor people are quite well connected to the rich people, and at the bottom, the poor people are not so well connected to the rich people. What you can see is that there's a strong gradient in terms of upward economic mobility. What this means is holding average incomes in a zip code fixed. Places where there's more economic connectedness have more upward income mobility. On the flip side, if you take a horizontal slice of this graph, you find the exact opposite. So this is now zip codes that have the same degree of economic connectedness. So poor people in those zip codes are all relatively well connected to rich people, but that have vastly different average incomes. Right? And what you can see is that once you have a substantial degree of economic connectedness, the average amount of resources available in a zip code don't seem to be highly predictive of upward economic mobility. So it really seems to be that economic connectedness is the predictor of upward income mobility, not median household incomes. And the literature that in the past has found median household incomes to be a good predictor of upward income mobility has really just found that because of that initial positive relationship. Areas where you have higher incomes are on average areas with higher economic connectedness, but you don't have to have a high income in order to have high upward income mobility as long as you can get substantial economic connectedness. So I'm going to the next few slides, and the last bit of my talk is really going to try and understand the drivers of economic connectedness. But before I do that, I want to spend 1 or 2 minutes trying to think about a specific question that that we've thought about a lot, which is, a lot of this paper focuses on the outcomes of relatively poor individuals, upward income mobility. What is the adult income rank of children growing up relatively poor in a neighborhood? And what we find is that that's strongly increasing in areas where you have more cross-class relationships. One might equally wonder what the higher degree of cross-class relationships does to the average outcomes of the rich. And I'm just going to give you the punchline of this, which is that while more cross-class connections seem to be improving the adult incomes of the poor, they seem to have very little effect on the adult incomes of the rich. So it doesn't seem to be that there has to be necessarily a trade-off between making lower income people better off in adulthood. That doesn't necessarily have to come alongside making relatively wealthier children worse off in adulthood. We can talk in the discussion, if you're interested, about what these types of cross-class interactions might do to relatively better off kids on other dimensions, the degree of social engagement, etc. I'm happy to speculate on that in the discussion. Okay. So with that in mind, now that we've seen that this economic connectedness seems to be strongly associated with upward income mobility, outcome we care about a lot, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the determinants of economic connectedness. What is it that makes some regions more connected than others? And what we do here is just conceptually is we're going to split the possible explanations into 2. The first one is what we're going to call exposure, or you can also think of this as segregation by income. Right? It could be in a given area that rich and poor children or rich and poor individuals aren't connected with each other because they're not exposed to each other. You have a very simple schematic here. It could be that all the rich children go to one school, all the poor children go to another school, and because there's so little, poor children are so not exposed to rich children, there's so few opportunities to make these cross-class friendships. So exposure could be one possible explanation. And again, exposure will differ across each setting. It'll be different in someone's high school, it might be different in someone's religious institution, it might be different in someone's recreational institutions, etc. But the second possible explanation is what we're going to call friending bias, which is the degree of interaction conditional on exposure. Right? It could also be that we're in the world of the second picture, which is that actually in terms of aggregates, schools are relatively well integrated. They have both rich and poor children in each school, but it could be that for whatever reason, rich children just befriend other rich children within a given school, and poor children just befriend other poor children within a given school. Right? So both exposure and friending bias can be determinants of the amount of cross-class interaction. So what we then do is we measure both poor people's exposure to rich people and poor people's friending bias within a whole range of different settings, including their neighborhoods, their workplaces, their colleges, their high schools, their recreation groups, and their religious groups. So what do we find? In terms of exposure, this is the extent to which poor children have rich children within the same institution. We find college, unsurprisingly, to be the strongest social setting. While relatively low-income students are less likely to go to college, when they go to college, they're actually surrounded by dramatically richer peers on average. On the other hand, we find neighborhoods and religious groups to be the most segregated by socioeconomic status and by income. Right? The neighborhoods and the religious groups where low SES individuals attend, are disproportionately also attended by other low SES individuals. What about friending bias? Friending bias is the extent to which you're likely to befriend a given high SES, is the extent to which a given low SES person is likely to befriend a given high SES person. Friending bias we find dramatically highest in neighborhoods. So even when rich and poor people live in the same zip code, they're very unlikely to interact with each other. And we find friending bias to be the lowest in recreational groups and in particular in religious groups. What does this mean? It means within recreational or religious groups, conditional on being, say, part of the same church, a poor person is equally likely to befriend a rich member of their church versus a poor member of their church. Similar with things like recreational groups, right? So again, you can think about different settings being made up of a combination of how segregated by socioeconomic status they are, and then how well they do in terms of fostering cross-group or cross-class interactions within that specific setting. Overall, we try to understand how important each of these two factors is in terms of explaining the overall national, what we call economic disconnect, the fact that low SES people have less than half of their friends be high SES, and we find both exposure and friending bias to be equally important in terms of their contribution. So what does this mean? This means that even if we were to perfectly integrate by socioeconomic status all social settings in the US, so all neighborhoods, all high schools, etc., having half of the individuals in these settings be low SES, half high SES, that would only close half the gap in terms of low SES and high SES friendships. Why? Because we saw before that even if low and high SES people are within the same school, for example, they're still more likely to be making friends with individuals similar to themselves than others, right? So both exposure and friending bias are important. What's interesting is that just like exposure, friending bias varies with institutional design. It is not just a pure preference, right? Otherwise, it would be very similar in religious groups and recreational groups, as it would be in workplaces and colleges, right? So the same individual might be much better at making rich friends in some setting than they are in another. And so then that opens a whole load of interesting questions in terms of trying to understand what is it about some settings or some institutions that allow us to foster this type of cross-SES interactions while others might be falling short. And I think that's going to be what I want to end on today, trying to really think about what might be possible interventions to allow us to increase connectivity. And in order to do that, in order to help us think through that, what we're going to do is rather than look at exposure and friending bias across these different settings, high schools versus colleges, I'm going to look at within each of these settings. So we have enough data to measure friending bias and socioeconomic status within each high school in the United States. And so that would lead to a graph like this here. So each dot on this graph here corresponds to a US high school. And on the horizontal axis here, we're plotting the share of high SES students in that high school. And on the vertical axis, we're plotting the degree of friending bias in the high school, where lower on this graph here is higher friending bias. These are high schools where low SES students are less likely to interact with a given high SES peer. And I just want to draw your attention, given you guys are mainly based in Chicago, to two schools on this graph, Walter Payton College Prep and Evanston Township High School. Payton and Evanston Township have very, very similar socioeconomic compositions. Both of them are relatively rich. About 70% of students going to both of these schools are high income. But what you can see is there's dramatically different friending bias. In Evanston Township, low SES students in that school are very unlikely to befriend their high SES peers. While in Walter Payton, you get a very different setting. In fact, low and high SES students are almost equally likely to befriend each other, right? And so this is just one example, and you could pick thousands of different ones from here. But what you can also do is you can try and do a more formal analysis. What could be going on in Evanston Township versus Walter Payton that's so different? And so one of the interesting things that we did is we actually looked at Evanston Township because it was such an outlier in terms of having social segregation within the high school. And we found a sociologist, Mary Barr, who attended Evanston Township High School, who noticed the amount of segregation. In particular, she noticed the amount of racial segregation, which quite often correlates with economic disconnection, in Evanston Township High School. And she described what she thought was going on in that high school. So here's what she says. She says, look, interracial friendships had been building and blossoming, beginning in elementary school and then flourishing in middle school. But when we entered Evanston Township, it came to an abrupt halt. The process of social segregation began in high school, reinforced by academic tracking that guided white students towards an academic focus and black students towards a vocational focus, right? And she says, look, this is where our friendships ended. When we think about tracking, we think about college bound, right? The gifted group, the AP class, or the remedial vocational courses. And that's where all of my black friends ended up. So one of the things she points out here in this sort of ethnographic study is that if you have within school academic tracking, which you have a lot of at Evanston Township, that might very much lead to within school segregation that you don't observe at a public magnet school like Walter Payton, where everybody tests in and there is not a lot of academic tracking within the school. In fact, we find this to be true in a statistical analysis. So here we're plotting friending bias within this high school on the vertical axis, and just the share of students that are in gifted and talented programs, one measure of the amount of academic tracking within the school on the horizontal axis. And what you can see is that the more academic tracking there is, the more friending bias you end up having, right? So this is just one example of something you can learn from in this data about what it is about schools that have more or less friending bias. We find a few other things. We find larger schools to generally have more friending bias. That's not all that surprising in many ways. I mean, it's the larger a certain group is, the easier it is to just move within people that are similar to you, right? If you show up to a small dinner party, you probably end up talking to everybody there. If you go to a party with 500 people, you might just end up talking to the people you already know that are similar to you, right? And so larger schools seem to have more problems with friending bias. Racially more diverse schools also seem to have higher friending bias on average. That's very much consistent with that ethnographic evidence from Maryborough. We can do the same thing, and there's lots of things that schools can do to tackle the amount of segregation. Berkeley High School was another school that had a ton of socioeconomic segregation within the school, and so they recently designed their curriculum to have sort of intentionally diverse incoming communities. Other things that matter a lot is physical design of space. This was something that I found fascinating. One of the schools we found, Lake Highlands High School, if you look back to our graph here, the school here, probably one of the highest friending bias schools anywhere in the country, the one right at the bottom you can see here. We were like, what was going on in that school? And actually one of the things that was interesting is that very recently, the amount of segregation in that school was something that was very much known to the high school principals and the people in that school. And what they found was that this was to a large extent driven by the physical design of space. So what had happened is that Lake Highlands the school buildings were a combination of 3 former different schools. And what they did is they kept all the different cafeterias. So it was one high school that had 3 different cafeterias. And you can see, and what they decided to do was, not thinking about this carefully, I guess, to only keep free and reduced lunch options in one of the cafeterias and not the others. And so what that ended up doing is all of the relatively poorer children who were eligible for free and reduced lunch would hang out at one cafeteria, or the other students would hang out in the other cafeterias. And so what the school did, it recently built a new school building and worked together with an architecture team specifically to try and create physical space for the students to interact with each other, right? And so this last sentence says, look, those students may still split into their own cliques within this hub that they create. They'll have more opportunities to cross paths and interact with peers from other social groups. So there's things that you can do, even in the physical design of space in order to create these types of interactions. We can do the same thing, and I'm not going to walk you through this in detail with colleges. So for every college in the US, we measure the degree of friending bias. What are things that correlate with lots of friending bias in colleges? The biggest thing is Greek life, right? Fraternities create a natural barrier, right? The dues to even participate in a fraternity can be thousands of dollars, a year or even a semester. That creates a natural barrier. And the more of your social life evolves around fraternities, the more that keeps low and high SES students separate from each other. It's just one other example of what we find in the data. So I'm going to end on this slide here by pointing out that we have, while we've produced all this sort of high school and zip code and college, etc. level data on all of these social capital measures, we've actually released that data for other people to look at and to explore. And in particular, we built this website call it the Social Capital Atlas. You can find it on socialcapital.org, where you can look at your own communities and you can really explore your own zip code, your own high school, your own college, as well as the neighboring ones, right? And our hope really is that people are going to use this as a resource to kind of build towards this broader knowledge of what is it that leads to a cross-class connectedness, what impedes it, what works in some schools, why does, high school principals, why does my school not have as much socioeconomic connectedness as sort of these three other schools that I'm quite familiar with? Let me try and look into what best practices are here, because in many ways, increasing economic connectedness potentially has this strong positive effect on upward income mobility, and doing it through reducing friending bias, in many ways seems to allow for very micro, very community level interventions that might not actually have to make anybody worse off. So it's one of the possibly relatively free lunches out there. And again, it's something we can all do in our own communities. We can all pay attention to. This is not something that requires substantial financial resources. It is not something that requires federal action. And so in a world of potential political gridlock, we really think that these types of interactions at the school and the neighborhood level hold the potential for positive change. And we hope that this data set will allow people to try and learn what it is that they can do in their own communities. Anil, I know being gone a few minutes over time, so I'm going to shut up now and let you guys continue.
Okay, but thank you so much, Johannes. Okay, we're going to have a brief musical interlude. You can collect your thoughts and get ready for some questions. If you'd like to make a donation, you can do it online on the YouTube channel. There's a link that will show you where to go. If you're in the room, you can scan the QR codes here, or there's a donation basket in the back. We suggest a donation of $5, but don't let that be a ceiling. And anything you can give is appreciated. We also appreciate all the work that everybody does to keep this group running. So we'll take a 2-minute break, and then we'll be back for Q&A. Okay, welcome back, and we'll now begin taking questions. I just want to start by saying, Johannes, that was a tour de force. The amount of work that you guys did to assemble all of this and then to give away the data is really, really amazing. And I'm not saying that because my kids went to Peyton. Okay, the first question will be here.
No, Anil, I can't. I mean, it's very, very faint from the room. So,
We're going to pivot for a sec here on this. Can you hear me okay now?
yes, very well.
So A, thanks for your talk. B, also proud parent of a couple Walter Payton College prep grads. And they actually are the reason the question I want to ask you is a little, it may not be helpful, and if you say it's not helpful, don't answer it. But because I have a 29-year-old and a 26-year-old, I was very aware of a paradigm shift in Facebook and who was there and how it was used literally through their high school. So I am Facebook friends with many of my 26-year-old kids' friends. They asked to be Facebook friends. None of my 29-year-old kids' friends did that. So my 26-year-old kids' friends show up with me as a data point, and I'm raising some boats with that data point, but I'm not that for my 29-year-old kids' friends. So I'm just curious if there's any tiny temporal effects and intergenerational effects on how Facebook has shifted from being kids to moms. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and part of the reason that our baseline sample focuses on this age range 25 to 45 as of today is precisely because I think that was while there is a cohort that uses it pretty intensively to represent the real world social networks on the platform. I think both people above 45, but also people below 25, it starts being difficult. I don't know whether the 26 versus 29, whether that's more a fluke event rather than something more systematic. So I think my sense is it's not something that happens within 2 or 3 age years, but something that happens across different generations. One of the things I want to point out, and I didn't have time to talk about today, Meta, the parent company of Facebook, also owns Instagram, and another social networking platform that is much more heavily used by today's teenagers. And so in the paper we also work with Instagram data to study the social connectedness, and particularly economic connectedness of today's teenagers on the Instagram platform, and we find very, very persistent results. So the same results where the parents are economically connected, the same zip codes where the parents are economically connected, their children today using Instagram data are also economically connected. So we think we do as much as we can to get around, both sort of, what does it mean to be a Facebook friend ever, and then how does that change over time, to make sure we're really capturing real world social networks as much as we can. I'm not going to be able to, I'm not going to claim that all friends are represented. I'm not going to claim all people who are Facebook friends are real friends. That's never going to be the case, but I think it's going to be true enough on average that it allows us to do these types of systematic analyses.
It's kind of comfortable for me to be here because I'm a teacher, but I wouldn't be here if I don't know what I'm talking about. But anyways, thank you very much, Johannes. It was a great presentation, what you did. I'm also an economist, and I appreciate all the academic study that you did there. Couple of questions are, one is an acknowledgement of the importance of economic mobility. As you know, income inequality is growing, especially in the United States, so this certainly has a significant impact, how economic mobility is declining. And in that respect, I would like to hear your views about how the trend of wealth concentration is connected to this analysis that you are doing. To what extent the conditions have changed over time that are leading to this condition that we are facing right now. And the other is, when I heard the topic, when I saw the topic, the title that refers to Facebook, I thought you will be also discussing the idea of how this world of social interconnection, social media has impacted the way we interconnect. And that certainly became more evident after the COVID. We transformed the way we interact. So I will be curious to hear your views about how this new world is affecting the way we connect and how that could transform, also impact the conditions for social connectivity and economic mobility. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, these are two very good questions. Let me talk about the first one, which is the relationship between economic mobility and income inequality. In some sense, the two don't necessarily have to be all that strongly connected, right? Income inequality is a cross-sectional statement in today's generation or within a generation, while income mobility is just how much you can move across generations, the positions within that income distribution. So you could have societies with very compressed incomes, and so very little inequality, but also very little mobility, right? If you're relatively poor, you stay poor within the relatively compressed measure. Or you could have societies with huge inequality, but lots of mobility. So within each generation, who are the billionaires gets shaken up completely, right? So they don't have to be necessarily linked. I do think that as income inequality is increasing, economic mobility in many ways becomes more important to sustain a certain amount of societal consensus around sustaining income inequality. I do think if most billionaires are self-made, people might be willing to accept a higher degree of income inequality than if it is just what you inherit from your parents, i.e. a world where you don't have a lot of income mobility, right? So I think those are just some thoughts on the relationship here. More concretely about the project we have, one of the things that had previously been shown is that there actually is a link between the two, that neighborhoods where you have higher inequality are also areas where you have less upward income mobility. So when the rich and the poor are very far apart in a neighborhood, the poor are less likely to rise up the income distribution. This is something that Alan Kruger, a famous economist, and Miles Korak and others had documented and called the Great Gatsby curve. Right? So the idea that areas with more within generation income inequality are areas with less across generation mobility. One of the things we find is that is entirely driven, at least in a statistical sense, by the fact that those areas where you have more income inequality are also areas with less economic connectedness. Right? So when the rich and the poor in an area are very different in terms of their incomes, the probability that the poor connect with the rich are also very low. Right? And so I think so just relating this, I think the reason why inequality leads to less mobility is because inequality leads to less economic connectedness, and economic connectedness seems crucial for income mobility. So that's kind of on that comment. Your second comment, I think is also a very interesting one, is about the causal effect of online social networks and the way we interact. And I want to be very clear here is that none of what we study in this paper, and this is a very intentional choice on our part, really speaks to the effect of Facebook or social media on any of these outcomes we care about. Right? In fact, we use social media largely to measure real-world social networks. And I think the most concrete way to see this is that what we can do is we can measure today, using the Facebook data, the friendships that someone had when they grew up as a kid, i.e. people who are friends with them that went to the same high school within 2 or 3 cohorts of them, etc. And what we can find is very, very similar relationships between those networks and income mobility for those individuals who formed those friendships and had their sort of, adult years before Facebook even came around. So this is one of the beauties. We can, in some sense, using data from today, using social media, measure connections people had before the social media platforms even came about, right? So this makes me think that none of what we're picking up here is the causal effect of Facebook. But your question was a bit different. It was more, inviting me to speculate whether that was going to change going forward, and whether or not links that you form on social media might substitute for, say, real-world friendship links to high-income individuals. And I think that's an interesting question. I honestly have the answers I don't know. In many ways, it would be great if this were the case. Why is that? Well, in this idea of thinking about what can you do to connect low and high income people, if that's your objective. One of the things we saw in one of the graphs I had was that having rich people around you geographically, in many ways almost feels like a necessary condition for poor people to form rich friends. It's not going to be sufficient. There can still be a lot of friending bias which prohibits them from becoming friends with each other, even if they're living in the same zip code or the same county. But if they don't even live in the same county, it's going to be very, very hard to form these links. And so because of that, a lot of policy, affordable housing policies, school busing policies, etc., have focused on creating, moving people, in physical space closer to each other, different people, in part to create these links. But those policies are very difficult to scale, and they haven't been enormously successful. And so it might be much, much easier to try and create online, social media friendships between high and low income people, because it doesn't necessarily require moving people in physical space, which is expensive and hard to execute. But I don't know if that's going to be as effective in terms of driving income mobility. I mean, there certainly are NGOs and community groups that are that have designed things like online mentoring programs with exactly this in mind, right? These are just purely online programs where you have a Zoom call once a week with your mentor, and maybe that can help. I think we need to do a more serious study of the effectiveness of those types of pure online links, and before we know to what extent they can substitute for real world cross-class linkages. I honestly don't know yet. I think it's a really interesting question. If it were to work, I think it would substantially expand the range of interventions you can think about to create economic connectedness.
Let's try that, Mike.
All right.
That's what you
Yeah, I was told both of them would work. So hi, thank you for the talk. It was pretty interesting and informative. So I had 2 questions. One of them was, is there also, in the cases where the lower SES folks are interacting with higher SES folks, is there also a understanding of the mental well-being of the kids? Like how do they feel? How do they, how are they? So is there an understanding of that? And the second one is that in the graph that you were showing, you showed the religious institutions as the ones which have the highest or lowest friendship bias. So what's it that they are doing that is allowing them to have that? So those are the 2 questions, and thank you.
Yeah, both good questions. I think on the first one, it's an important, it's an important question. I think it's even broader than the way you framed it, which is, you could, despite the fact that this is, as Anil mentioned, and I've talked with Anil about this project for probably the 5 years that we've been working on this. So, but despite sort of that extensive, research effort, it's still in many ways you can think of as a relatively narrow research project, because the main outcome we're studying is, upward income mobility. And as you rightly point out, these types of cross-class connections can have a whole range of other outcomes. And so, many of these are very hard to study because they're very hard to measure. So, things like, psychological well-being, etc., is hard to measure. And so I can't give you a good answer here, except to say we hope that the fact that the data is now out will allow people that have, say, survey-based measure on psychological well-being can actually start looking at how it correlates, at least, with economic connectedness, right? So, again, we have good data on upward income mobility as economists, but, we don't have very good data on some of these other outcomes you might care about. And that brings me back to sort of one other question, that I briefly talked about earlier, which is, one possible outcome that you could care about is do these types of interventions make higher SES, these types of interactions make higher SES kids, for example, more compassionate, right? That's some theory and some empirical work in other settings that suggests that that might be the case, right? And so that would be another possible outcome to study. That is one we are actually hoping to study in follow-on work. I think that was your first one. Can you please remind me just a keyword of what the second question was? I've just escaped my mind.
With regards to the religious.
Yes, the religious groups, exactly. So So I think what's interesting about religious groups is, I guess you have to just, firstly, you're exactly right. Religious groups are places where low and high SES people, conditional on being part of the same religious group, are more likely to interact with each other than in any other setting. Let me just preface a discussion of that finding with a prior statement. Remember, in order to create economic connectedness, you need both. You need exposure, and then you need low friending bias. Religious groups are actually some of the most segregated social groups we observe in the data, right? So rich people go to some church, poor people go to another, broadly speaking, right? Only neighborhoods are even more segregated than churches. High schools, recreation groups, colleges are more integrated. So I think just putting that aside, overall, despite the low friending bias, religious groups aren't this big sort of driver of economic connectedness, precisely because they start out being relatively segregated. But having said that, there does seem to be something about both religious groups and recreational groups that, at least to the extent that they do bring people together, the probability of forming these cross-class friendship links seems to be, almost at random, right? So this type of, homophily by friending, by socioeconomic status seems to not exist. And to be honest, we don't know very well why that is. I think there's two hypotheses that we have that, would bring both, religious groups and recreational groups together, which is that I think people that attend these institutions have sort of a broad common interest that might be able to dwarf out these other differences, right? So when you go to a church, you will have the same religious belief. When you go to a soccer, a pickup soccer game, you all have the same interest in the sport. And maybe, having this sort of very strong, but also very salient common interest on some dimension that is potentially unrelated to your socioeconomic status might allow you to overcome that. And I've become more convinced by this. I recently gave a presentation to some of our NYU undergraduate students about this research. And I had kind of discussion with them afterwards, just kind of, we're in this exploring stage. We're trying to figure out what creates these cross-class links and what doesn't. And one thing that I thought was really striking is one of the students mentioned her observation, not based on statistics, but just her own observations, that it was much easier to make these types of friendships in electives than it was in core classes. And she said, the electives, kind of everybody's there for the same reason. They want to learn specifically about this topic. And for some reason, that common interest in her observation was also something she thought made it easier to just become friends with everybody in the class rather than just with people that were similar to you. So that's consistent, I think, with the story that we're hoping to tell here. Again, at this stage of speculation, for us, this is really just the beginning of what's probably going to be a decade-long research agenda to really try and understand what's going on here.
Before we take the next question, it's interesting you say that. I thought that maybe you would look at all this research and say something like national service requirements that force people to mix could be an engine for mobility, but it sounds like that could be like a core class, and it wouldn't work. But I do have a sense that people used to, through the Army, have to meet people that were very different than them, and by your research, that's a good thing. I don't know if you guys have done this outside the United States to try to see if...
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's something... So first of all, we haven't done this outside the US, but that's at least one possible direction for us to go. I mean, each direction we pick will be like 3 years of work, so we're going to try and figure out where really the value added is the biggest, but certainly expanding, these measures of social capital globally is something that holds a lot of appeal. We've heard from a lot of people, in particular Israelis, as Anil knows, we have lots of Israelis in the economics profession, and many of them went to the military, and they were telling us exactly what you were just saying, is that, the place where I formed the most cross-class friendship links was in the military. And so it's not something we have formally studied, but I think you might well be right that one of the effects of military service or national service, doesn't have to be military, but sort of really putting people together from all backgrounds in a way that they're not choosing to be together necessarily. I mean, you might be choosing to do national service, but then you're not picking your peer group immediately. Might well have this beneficial effect of creating cross-class connections. I remember when conscription was abolished in Germany, 15, 20 years ago, I think one of the strongest arguments against getting rid of it was exactly this idea that conscription was really important for sort of societal, fabric, because it was the one time when everybody got to meet everybody, and subsequent, at every subsequent stage, people opted out of, the things that mixed people. And I think, honestly, to me personally, it's one of the big fears I have about, the post-COVID period and working from home, because I feel, it's not perfect, but the one place where you're still interacting with people that you haven't selected yourself, at least not perfectly, is at work, right? Not all of your colleagues are people that you would necessarily hang out with, in a personal capacity. And I think the commute to work, right, in particular in a place like New York City, the subway, etc. And so I think, as we go to more working from home, I fear we're taking one more thing off the table where people are interacting with a wider range of individuals, not all of whom they've selected necessarily. So I think, I do think being mindful about what settings we have left that create that sort of, town square venue where everybody's interacting with everybody is quite valuable. You can think about public libraries, city parks, etc. So other things that might be playing that role, but we shouldn't underestimate what that does to, to the possibility of friendship links and social links more broadly across individuals that are different from each other.
Well, thank you for being here. Social mobility for me is something that takes place over time. So someone growing up in modest or poor conditions and later in life doing better for himself. And from what you presented, I had a difficult time seeing how that was being measured in the study and how it was showing where social mobility was occurring. The second takeaway I had was just the predominance of the central states and upper Midwest in the dark blue categories. And if you could give us some comments of why you think that area has done better than other parts of the country.
So the first one on measuring upward income mobility, you're exactly right. I didn't spend any time in the presentation going into detail here. So this is comes from earlier work from the Opportunity Insights team using anonymized tax data. So what they do is they link individuals' tax returns to the tax returns of their parents to do exactly that over time analysis using anonymized data at the IRS. So this is not data that we have, it's not something we measure in the Facebook data, but at the zip code level, it is something that has been measured and released by previous researchers. And exactly, it's with anonymized tax record data linking children and their parents. And you're right, that's exactly the type of data you would need to be able to talk about income mobility in a systematic way. So I think that's on that. I agree with you. The Upper Midwest looks interesting. Right? There's something there, and I think it's a lot of it is lower friending bias, right? I guess you guys live closer to there than I do. Are people more friendly there? Is it easier? I mean, one of the things that will contribute, I'm going to say, in part to this, it's probably a relatively racially homogeneous part of the country. So that will, in some of the statistics we've seen, the more racially diverse a certain part of the country is, the more friending bias we have. I mean, I think it's a well-documented fact in sociology, and kind of shows up in this data as well, that there's racial homophily. People are more likely to be friends with others of the same race. And so if you're going to have largely racially homogeneous areas, you are going to see lower friending bias. And so that might be part of the contribution. But I really think, this is really where we're hoping the research that we do, but hopefully also others who can download our data and start working with it, will contribute to. What is it about those schools, those zip codes, those counties where you have high economic connectedness, where you have low friending bias? What is it about these places that generates the higher economic connectedness? So I'm going to punt every now and then. I say this is what we're hoping to find out next. Our first step was really just measuring it and providing some of these initial correlation, initial insights. But really, I think this is just the beginning of what I expect to be a pretty intense number of years for us and others to really try and better understand this.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about friending bias versus exposure. It seems like the line is a little blurry sometimes when, like I was just thinking about Evanston Township High School, if you go to the same school but you are tracked and so you never actually have any classes with another person, it doesn't feel like friending bias, it feels more like exposure. And the level of geography also, like if you're in a zip code that's heavily segregated within that zip code, it might look like friending bias when it's really just I never go to that side of the train tracks or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's actually a very perceptive comment, and you're exactly right. We have this
PhD in economics.
Okay. No, you're exactly right. We have this line in the paper somewhere where we say that it's not really a conceptual distinctions for the exact reasons that you mentioned, right? Like academic tracking within a high school will lead to lower exposure rather than friending bias. So in many ways, the way that I think about this is I think about this at the unit where interventions can happen, right? And so I'm going to try and measure it within each high school. Because there is sort of, there's a high school principal or a school board or something that has the ability to make changes within that high school. But your comment exactly stands. The distinction is less clear than I think, the way that I described it. And the reason we do want to separate, or the reason why we are thinking about these, the zip code. Actually, the zip code is probably a bad example because the zip code or the neighborhood, there isn't really a particular decision maker that is that has the ability to make changes there. But for the others, we've picked the level of aggregation where we think possible interventions might happen and then measure it there. But yeah, I think your comment is well taken, and it's a very perceptive.
Okay, I think we're almost out of questions, but I'm going to ask you one. This is a little inside baseball, but for a long time, I used to ask other economists, what can we do about economic mobility, and what programs do we know that succeed? And the answer is not a lot, but one of your co-authors and his team previously had studied this Move to Opportunity program, and that was a program where people were given vouchers and allowed to just switch areas. And what they found, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Johannes, is that when people did move to areas where they encountered many more people that were different, so it was mostly low SES people moving sometimes to high SES neighborhoods, that you saw a lot of mobility. One thing that was puzzling about that research was you didn't see them accelerating, as I understand it, during high school. It showed up like 10 years later that they would turn out to be much, much better. And so I'm wondering, is the same kind of mechanism or pattern in your data that if you were to look at these people that have, caught up or done better than their parents, how quickly do these effects kick in? And what does that tell you about the mechanism by which this is working? So is it by the time they're 24, they're on the path, or do they need to be 30, or what? And what do we learn from that?
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, we don't know well, because if you're going to use income as your outcome measure, measuring it ahead of your early 30s in the tax return data is going to be quite misleading, because you're going to have a lot of people saying graduate school and medical school in their late 20s that look very poor, but what you really want to measure is sort of their lifetime trajectory, which is why, for a lot of these measures of income ability, we and Raj and earlier on really focused on age 35 as kind of, a reasonable time when we think your long-run income prospects might have realized. So you could, in principle, look at things like test scores along the way. We don't have that data in this project, and so we're really just stuck to looking at age 35 without being able, to speak much along the way. I mean, I do think, maybe just to your broader question about like what policies work, and et cetera. I mean, it's kind of two comments. I think the first one is, on those moving to opportunity experiments, but, more broadly speaking, things like Section 8 housing vouchers in New York, the idea of providing resources to lower income people so that they can live in higher income neighborhoods. One of the things that is interesting in some of the most recent work I've seen there in the work they've done in Seattle with Larry Katz and others is that just giving a housing voucher by itself is not actually all that effective, and people don't end up moving to the right quote-unquote neighborhoods, the high upward income mobility neighborhoods, the good opportunity neighborhoods. But that combining the financial resources with mentoring, with guidance, with social capital is actually very, very important to make even a move to opportunity type intervention successful. So I think that's kind of an interesting, it's not directly related to our work, but this idea that information and social networks combined with resources might be way more effective than just providing resources, I think is at least consistent with the story we have in mind here. There's a second, a second question about, what types of, with the caveat to the previous question in mind, you can think of, well, one possible thing you can do is you can increase exposure, which you can do through, moving to opportunity, etc. Or what you can do is you can reduce, reduce friending bias. And really, my takeaway from looking at this is that we should be spending a lot more time, at a policy level, thinking about friending bias. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. I think the first one is that things like moving to opportunity and rezoning and so on. There's general equilibrium effects that are generally not necessarily focused on in the past. So one thing, just to give you an example, right? If my idea is, okay, what I'm going to do is I want to increase economic connectedness in a high school, and so I'm going to move a bunch of high-income students into that high school, right? That's some kind of policy that you could have. So that's going to increase economic connectedness in that high school, but because there's only so many high-income students around, almost by definition, they're not in some other school, right? And so economic connectedness will go up in the school you move them to, it'll go down in whichever school you move them from, right? So there's all of these general equilibrium effects that you have when you move people around that I think aren't really studied much and that I think are important to bear in mind. And then, the scalability of these programs I think are difficult. Reducing friending bias, you can reduce friending bias in one place without having to increase it anywhere else. And in fact, one of the things we see in some early other work also is that once you reduce friending bias in one setting, and people start making, rich people start making friends with poorer students, actually when they then go to another setting, they're again more likely to make friends with them. So there's these interesting knock-on effects you get from creating the friendships in some settings to increasing the rate of friendship formation even in other settings down the road. And this is something, sometimes called the contact hypothesis in sociology, is something that sociologists aren't surprised by, but it's there are these additional, if you want, multiplier effects on what you can do. So my sense is, broadly speaking, what can you do policy-wise? If you believe the results that we have, it seems like some of these interventions, thinking about what can you do to reduce friending bias, seem very effective. And schools and colleges are two great social settings where I think we have potentially many of the levers that we want. I mean, for schools, you find things like schools that have school uniforms have substantially lower friending bias on average. That's a really interesting finding. It's consistent with like clothing and jewelry being an important class marker. You take that off the table and you reduce the amount of friending bias. Things like high school sports. This was interesting to me. I as you know, a foreigner, I didn't really say what a pep rally was. But schools that have a lot of school spirit and they do Friday pep rallies before the football games, before the basketball games, etc., those seem to be places with lower friending bias. So again, creating these settings, these venues where everybody across the entire school gets together and has this common communal thing can be very important in terms of forming these friendship links. There's lots of other things that you can think about. And again, our hope is people are going to use this data, discover many more things than we've already discovered, and that we can develop over time a set of best practices. And same with college deans. There's a lot of things we can do, starting from randomized dorm assignment in the first years. The list is long. Greek life keeps coming up as an important feature, etc. So there's lots of things that we can think about and do to, community by community, to reduce friending bias with the current composition that we have within that community, right? So you don't need to necessarily change the composition of a school or a college in order to improve economic connectedness. And I think we need to think much more about what types of policies we have and how do we scale them, that lead us down that route.
Okay, I'm sorry we've run out of time, but that was fascinating and tremendous work that we're all going to watch with eager eyes. So thanks so much. I hope you're going to go off to Oktoberfest and enjoy the rest of the evening. And
Thanks, Daniel.
thanks so much, Johannes. And I'm going to leave you with some parting words from Nathaniel Hawthorne, who said, "Religion and art spring from the same root and are close kin. Economics and art are strangers." So have a great rest of the day. There'll be a community reception now for anybody who's interested. I think given how nice it is outside, we'll probably stand outside, but you're welcome to attend that. And otherwise, thanks for taking time today to be here with us.